Hello and welcome to TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and combat false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. The Hungarian government says it intends to resume operation of the Druzhba oil pipeline through Ukraine by any means necessary. Now, these statements come as Russian oil transit through Ukrainian territory remains suspended. And yes, that message was amplified directly by Viktor Orbán himself on X. So instead of asking why the pipeline stopped, Budapest is talking about forcing it back online. Because apparently the preferred solution to a damaged oil route is geopolitical muscle flexing.
Győzni fogunk, és erőből fogunk győzni. Vannak politikai és pénzügyi eszközeink, és ezzel rá fogjuk őket szorítani, feltétel nélkül, és lehetőleg hamarosan újra nyissák meg a barátság olajvezetéket. Szeretném világossá tenni, hogy győzni fogunk, és erőből fogunk győzni. Tehát semmilyen paktumot nem kötök, semmilyen kiegyezés nem lesz, le fogjuk őket verni. Az olajblokkádot le fogjuk törni. Rá fogjuk kényszeríteni az ukránokat, hogy indítsák újra a szállításokat. Nem üzlettel, nem megegyezéssel, nem kiegyezéssel, hanem erőből fogjuk elérni.
But what's the real reason for the blockade though? Well, on January 27, 2026, Russian shelling caused extensive damage to an oil pumping station near Brody. Technical and auxiliary equipment was destroyed. A large-scale fire broke out and burned for several days before it was extinguished. Some components were completely destroyed and replacements aren't available. Doesn't sound like a Ukraine problem, does it? The European Commission, meanwhile, says the suspension of oil supplies to Hungary and Slovakia doesn't really threaten energy security. The countries have reserves and alternative supply routes, including the Adriatic pipeline, which means the narrative about Ukraine staging an oil blockade to Europe collapsed pretty quickly. The damage caused by Russia highlights something obvious. Moscow bears responsibility for the shutdown of the oil pipeline, and the market is already adjusting. Investors and companies are planning to redirect resources through alternative routes. Oil refineries in the region are preparing to adapt supplies, which again exposes the accusations coming from Hungary as nonsense. At the end of the day, they opted for Russian oil not because it's their only choice, but because it's cheaper. Belarus, together with Russia, continues to play an active role in schemes exporting agricultural products stolen from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. According to investigators from the Belpol, more than 2 million tons of grain were exported from temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories in 2025 alone. So according to Belpol, companies linked to former Belarusian Interior Minister Viktor Naumov are actively exporting rapeseed and sunflower seeds taken from occupied Ukrainian territories. At facilities in Belarus, the stolen harvest is mixed with local raw materials and then quietly repackaged under the label Made in Belarus. Experts say these schemes work because sanctions do not explicitly ban agricultural imports from Belarus, which means that anyone buying those Belarusian seeds may actually be paying for a harvest taken from occupied land and then indirectly funding the regime of Alexander Lukashenko, as well as supporting the war against Ukraine. Belpol investigators say Russia and Belarus have built an entire network of companies and logistic chains to move these products quietly. The grain rarely travels in a straight line. It's often routed through certain countries where the origin is conveniently adjusted before it reaches international markets. By the time it arrives, the paperwork looks clean. The harvest, however, started on occupied Ukrainian fields. Recently, Sergei Lavrov made another statement that quickly caught the attention of international observers. Commenting on tensions in the Middle East, he said that people who suffer from the aggression of the United States and Israel are Russia's strategic partners. According to this diplomatic logic, any country or force that happens to be in conflict with the United States or Israel automatically qualifies as Russia's peace-loving partner.
Я говорю об этом с чувством глубокого сожаления, потому что речь идет о наших близких друзьях. Все те, кто страдает от агрессии Соединенных Штатов и Израиля, наши стратегические партнеры, мы поддерживаем с ними диалог и будем делать все, чтобы вместе с другими миролюбивыми членами мирового сообщества, в том числе в Совете Безопасности, ООН, на Генеральной Ассамблее, способствовать созданию атмосферы, которая будет делать эту операцию совершенно невозможной.
Lavrov's statement also includes a phrase that deserves a moment of attention: peace-loving members of the international community. Now, that wording sounds especially bold coming from a country that has, been waging a full-scale war against Ukraine for several years, which makes Russia presenting itself as a voice of peace a bit difficult to square with reality. But these messages are not aimed only at foreign audiences, they are also meant for domestic viewers, because the Kremlin wants to frame Russia as the center of an alternative international coalition, a club of countries that are united mainly by dissatisfaction with Western policy. Lavrov's remarks show how Russian diplomacy tries to turn every international crisis into an opportunity to build new political alliances. But the logic behind these alliances is telling. They often look less like partnership built on shared values and more like a gathering of states that simply happen to share the same grievance. In other words, not a coalition of principles, but of resentment. During another broadcast, Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov threatened to destroy the Kyiv Dam as soon as the snow melts. A statement like this have become routine in Russian propaganda. They're designed to sound dramatic, threatening, and loud enough to create an atmosphere of fear and pressure on Ukrainian society. In other words, another evening on Russian state television.
Тогда в моей с вами дискуссии непонятна цель ваша. Вы говорите, надо снести Киев к чертовой матери. Причем тут Киев снести к военнослужащим, которые хотят воевать и будут воевать против нас, против России.
Киев надо снести. Харьков, Одессу.
Цель зачем?
Цель уничтожения. Парализация воли укронацистской сволочи, которая проголосовала за террориста Зеленского в свое время и продолжает радоваться смерти русских людей. Но я добрый, поэтому я говорю только о военно-политических целях в этих городах. Я говорю только о центрах принятия решений, не о жилых кварталах. Мы не обстреливаем, как вы, не вы лично, Василий Дмитриевич, а как украинские нацисты, которые бьют по жилым кварталам наших городов. Нет, мы так не делаем. Но все центры принятия решений должны быть уничтожены, а Киевская дамба должна быть снесена. Но вот мы подождем, пока снежок растает, то хохлам сейчас кажется, что вот они весь Киев загадили, мы его очистим методом Геракла. Дамбу снести, и вода все смоет.
Она затопит мирных людей.
Мирные люди успеют уйти.
This rhetoric mirrors the broader policy of the Kremlin, which continues to label the war against Ukraine a special military operation. At the same time, the media space is filled with intimidations, threats, and manipulation. Messages like Solovyov serve several purposes at once. They demonstrate Moscow's aggressive stance, while also feeding the information war aimed at demoralizing civilians and weakening international support for Ukraine. Kremlin audiences are served the same storyline. Russia is strong, Ukraine is weak. In reality, it functions as cover. It helps explain away the failure of the Russian army and portray Ukraine as permanently on the brink of disaster. Look, Solovyov can shout, threaten dams, and keep building his personal brand of televised catastrophe, but the broadcast fantasy collides with reality. Ukrainian cities are standing, infrastructure is being restored, defenders continue protecting the country from real threats. And every new threat from Solovyov ends up just sounding more like old men yelling at the sky. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.